Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friends Show. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you doing?
How's it, Nick? How's it going?
Yeah, it's going all right. Just before the show, Marius was witness to a shootout, which is, I'm told, an exciting event on the East Rand, apparently. But yeah, no, as far as we know, no one got killed. But it's part of the color of what's going on at the moment. And we also joined. Yeah, go ahead, Marius.
I was going to say I had to check my car when I got home just to make sure there are no bullet holes, but it seemed okay though.
Yeah. No, it's terribly exciting. And also, Sara Gon. Sara, how are you doing? Oh, Sara, are you back with us?
Was that me or you? Yeah, no, I haven't witnessed any shootouts. I haven't even heard angle grinders, grinding angles and things in my front of my house. So it's been very calm and collected here.
Maybe because there's no electricity to do these kind of things.
Everybody's poor generation. Everyone.
You from the rich parts of Johannesburg, not like me from the East Rand.
Well, regional conflicts aside, let's quickly have a word from our sponsor, Bitvice. And Bitvice says, concerned about the poor performance of the South African Rand and local investment returns when planning for your retirement? Look no further than bitvice.io, the reputable white glove Bitcoin service designed to provide you with a secure and professional approach to navigating the world of Bitcoin. With a proven track record, Bitcoin offers potential growth opportunities amidst economic uncertainties. At bitvice.io, we prioritize your security and empower you with self-custody, ensuring complete control and protection of your Bitcoin holdings. Discover the benefits of self-custody and secure your financial future with bitvice.io. Visit their website today, and there'll be a link to that in the description of the show. All right, let's get on to the first news of the day, and this is one of those pieces of information that I think kind of shatters narrative. So, we're often told this sort of story about the country that, the ANC is really, it's truly representative of South African people. A lot of its policies, whether you like them or hate them, or whether you think they're good or bad, they represent the authentic will of the population. And that the ANC loves to adorn this mantle for themselves, claiming to be the voice of Black South Africans or the voice of the working class or something like that. Well, occasionally, various organizations, the IRR included, but other organizations too, like Afrobarometer in this case, go out and actually ask the people of South Africa what they think on issues, rather than just having pundits interpret it for them. And oftentimes you find things that are quite interesting and run against the sort of lazy cliche narratives. So we've got one here, and it shows that a majority of South Africans want Eskom to be privatized. So Afrobarometer did a representative sample of about 1,600 adult South Africans for their latest survey. There were some interesting findings in this report. About 87% said that government is doing an abysmal job of providing reliable electricity supply, which is 24% up from last year. About 70% say government performance is very bad. The provision of electricity has risen now to being the third most pressing issue in terms of what people think is their top priority. Unemployment came in first, with 52% of people saying that was their top priority, was one of their priorities rather. Crime and security at 38%, electricity at 32%, water supply at 21%, and corruption down at 19%, which is interesting because corruption, I think, quite recently was either in second or third place, and it's dropped to fifth. But anyway, the people also asked whether they would prefer to pay more for electricity in exchange for better services rather than paying less and receiving poor services. About 51% agreed or strongly agreed with that sentiment. When it came to privatization, 59% said that to ensure adequate electricity supply, Eskom must be privatized, as opposed to only 25% who disagreed and 16% who didn't know, refused to answer, or couldn't make up their mind. Unsurprisingly, I think, considering it's already an opposition voting area, the Western Cape, 73% of respondents said that they wanted Eskom to be privatized. The province where it had the weakest support for privatization was Northwest, where 49% said that they wanted it to be privatized. When you look at only people with no formal schooling, 47% said that they would want Eskom to be privatized. And amongst poor South Africans, I'm not sure how the survey decided what poor means, but in this case, as they rated it poor, about 50% said that they prefer that privatization over the status quo. With the sort of slightly softer position of that Eskom should lose its monopoly, which doesn't quite mean the same thing. About 76% of people were in favor of Eskom losing its monopoly, and that's majorities amongst every single economic group that they surveyed. People who are wealthy, people who are poor. And I think this is fascinating because it really shows that the ANC is serving entirely an ideological or patronage agenda here rather than some sort of popular will. And in fact, when you actually ask people about these things, they're far less ideological than many commentators assume they'll be, right? Marius, what do you make of this survey?
Yeah, well, it's quite unsurprising, I think. And it shows that, I mean, I think we all know that the ANC often doesn't really listen to what people want. That's not always a bad thing. I think if tomorrow there was a referendum asking if South Africans were in favor of something like gay marriage, I think most people would probably say they're not. And that's where you have to balance the rights of what's majority versus individual rights and so on. So that's not quite the same here, I don't think. I mean, just looking at those numbers, it's nearly 90% of people in the Free State say Eskom should be privatized. So it's actually quite amazing. And it shows that, I think Eskom is obviously one of the biggest issues facing South Africa at the moment. Just quite an interesting point from that survey. Another survey was done, said about 10 years ago, where they'd also, so at this survey, the people are asked, to respond and so on. 95% of them lived in areas which were connected to the electricity grid. The last time they'd asked a similar question about 10 or 12 years ago, it said only 86% of people had been connected to the electricity grid. So from that point of view, the ANC government has actually done a pretty good job of connecting people to the electricity grid. But as we know, it'd be the same thing as if the government gave everybody a car. That'd be amazing. But if none of the cars can work, and if people, the cars don't have engines and people can't afford to put petrol into the car, it's quite a useless thing. And I think that's the problem with electricity now. Even if you connect to the grid, you're not getting electricity all the time. And the costs of electricity are becoming so high that a lot of people almost can't even afford electricity anymore.
And also, even if you take into account the sort of increase of number of people on the grid, I think that because of, I think I'm correct in saying, and I do stand under correction here, that because of energy saving technologies over the last couple of years, things like energy saving light bulbs, people going off grid, et cetera, we actually, as a whole, use slightly less electricity than we did about 10 years ago. The problem is supply, not demand.
But also, okay.
Go ahead.
No, but also, we've been electrifying different places around the world for now. Mass electrification started beginning about 140 years ago. So obviously the technology to connect people to the grid, it's much more efficient and so on. And it's actually laughable that the ANC can't even manage to give people electricity all the time. It's not a failure of technology or anything like that. It's just a failure of management. And, actually connecting people to the grid and producing electricity is actually one of the easiest things that can happen in modern society, actually. Obviously, it costs money because you've got to build the power stations and so on. But these power stations aren't complex. Even a nuclear power station isn't, you obviously need to get people who know what they're doing, but you don't have to get, people with 200 IQs to manage the place. You just need to get decent engineers and decent maintenance and so on. So it's an absolute disgrace that ANC can't even manage to run, carry on giving people electricity. And I think it's going to be a huge election issue going to election next year, which also means I think the ANC is going to really concentrate on it. And I think they will be burning through diesel like there's no tomorrow to make sure that load shedding isn't a big issue leading up to next year's election.
Sara, what do you make of this survey? I think there's a sort of larger question here about how, and this is, I think, one of the complicated questions about how South Africa works, is that despite the ANC's sort of ideological direction being at odds with the majority of the population, people still are willing to vote for it. And I'd argue that part of the reason for that is because they're very good at convincing voters that they're not as radical as they actually are. But what's your take on the survey and the high support for privatization amongst South Africans?
No, I think it's a practical response, and particularly if you've put people on the grid who were poor, weren't on the grid. The minute you sort of interrupt their supply on a as regular basis as they are now, their lives do become much more difficult, as we know, but for them as well, because they will be putting in place electric hobs and electric kettles and that sort of thing, and essentially making their lives safer than sort of burning their way through stuff. And this is going to be an issue. I mean, it's literally going to impinge on lifestyles, and it'll probably cannot be resolved the way perhaps in the middle classes and upper middle classes we can do it. I don't think the people are that ideological, but I think the attachment, such as it remains to the ANC, has a lot to do with the mythology and being the so-called liberator of people, and there's an emotional attachment more than an ideological one, and that's why I think you tend to get a realistic view of the fact that Eskom should be privatized, but still a sort of completely different base for why people may continue to support the ANC. But I think the ideology, the strength of the ideology lies with the ANC. I think Marius Roodt had said that Eskom, like SAA and SAPO, post office, is dying, and the only thing that makes sense to remain a state competence is transmission. Otherwise, everything else should be done and needs to be done by the private sector if we're to get out of any of this mess relatively quickly. And that's probably correct. But as I say, I think these concerns are practical and they are a response to experience. And in a greater or lesser form, we're all having the same experience. So the interesting fact, I think, almost is that unemployment is still the number one issue of grievance. And it's been in our surveys for years. And I think people understand that a job, and preferably a decent job, or hopefully ultimately a decent job, is far more value than a whole lot of other things. And other things may fall into place more if they had access to employment. And I think that's probably generally true.
So Marius, last thoughts on this. This presumably is an opportunity for the opposition, right? If they can reach all of these voters who probably don't hear from them very much, who they probably don't have branches near, who are mostly disconnected from the media environment, and say, hey, look, here's what you believe, and here's how we represent you, and here's how the government does it. They could potentially turn that into votes. I mean, do you think that that's a realistic proposition?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing about SA and the post office. If they collapse, that doesn't mean that South Africa, if Eskom stops working, South Africa's in huge trouble. With SAA, cool, you can't fly SA anymore. You can fly Safir or, Virgin or Etihad or whatever. Same as the post office. You just use a courier or whatever. It's obviously for people who don't really have the money to use couriers all the time, it's not great at all. I mean, everybody's got access to email and so on these days. But I mean, Eskom is just a magnitude difference when if it had fell compared to the post office and SAA and so on. And I think that's definitely something the opposition has to do. But there's also, when people vote, it's not just South Africa. This is all around the world. People don't just vote on issues. There's also emotional attachment to political parties. I mean, I've said it before on the show. Say, for example, in the north of England, people will vote Labour because their dad voted Labour and their dad voted Labour or Tory or whatever the case is. Even if they don't necessarily agree with the policies or they don't even read the policies, they are a Tory voter or they are a Labour party. They are a Labour voter. You could put a potato with the rosette as the candidate and say this is our candidate for the Labour Party for Parliament, and people will go vote for it. It's quite a very few, well, it's not very few, but it's quite a process for people to start changing their vote. And I think that is starting to happen in South Africa. If you look at how the ANC's vote is starting to decline, it's definitely people are definitely starting to look for other political vehicles, whether it's the EFF or Action SA or even the DA and so on. And just on one final point to this, I remember reading a book about 1980s politics in South Africa, and there was a survey of Afrikaners who were National Party supporters. And the majority of those people said they would still vote for the National Party, even if they disagreed with the National Party policies. So I think it's, as I say, I think with voting, it's a very complex thing. A lot of it is an emotional attachment, but I think with such a, people are they're going to forget about the black, green, and gold and Nelson Mandela when they have their electricity for 3 days, and they're like, yes, you know what, I could vote for the Steenhuisen guy and the DA, maybe, if they can promise we're going to have electricity. But as I say, it's a very complex thing, and it's not just about the electricity. I mean, that's obviously a huge issue, but there's people vote for very, very complex reasons.
All right, let's move on to our next topic. And there's been some recent talk about the National Health Insurance Bill, which has recently passed through the Portfolio Committee of Parliament. The South African Medical Association has come out in opposing the bill, saying that the bill was developed with disregard to the legitimate concerns of experts, particularly on critical issues such as the introduction of contracting units for primary healthcare, benefit packages, reimbursement models, and other issues. The Medical Association says that despite the bill's claims to help the country realize universal healthcare coverage for all, that it's really not the solution, and it's most likely just going to damage the current system rather than actually expanding the scope of healthcare. They said the NHI bill in its current form sets up the healthcare system for failure at the expense of further deterioration of the health and well-being of all who live in the country. Misappropriation of funds in various state-owned entities casts doubt on government's ability to handle the healthcare budgets responsibly. Let me start with you again, Sara. I assume you agree with some of what the Medical Association has said here. I'm always frustrated about the sort of claims that NHI will realize universal healthcare coverage, because in theory, South Africa already has effectively universal healthcare coverage. It's just of such bad quality that government is now seeking to find some other source of funding for it. Sorry, you're muted.
I had airplanes. I had airplanes and things going on overhead. I think the basic tenet is that whatever it undertakes to do, it is not cost. The government has not costed the NHI, and almost no one I know doesn't think won't be anything but a real grift. Huge amounts of money administered by huge bureaucracy equals huge amounts of money disappearing and not into the healthcare sector. Not to mention that the whole style of healthcare will change, and the nature of private healthcare will change. And private healthcare, I mean, the people, the big taxpayers, will leave if private health, if it will leave in greater numbers if healthcare deteriorates. And look, our private healthcare is extraordinary. But the private healthcare industry has, offered to do all sorts of things under the NHI to help the government. But even someone as sort of, I don't know what the correct term is, but very favourable towards dealing with the government on NHI, such Adrian Gore of Discovery, has been angered by the fact that the current iteration of the bill has barely changed from the previous iteration of the bill. And the view they take from that is they have not listened at all to input from the private sector. And I'm sure this is absolutely correct. I think, and for the first time, Discovery's talked about, unconstitutional, taking legal action. Well, that would be a great relief, because there is so much wrong, and there's a lot the private sector could do to make healthcare better in this country, public healthcare better, because they know how to do healthcare. The government doesn't know how to do healthcare, but they do a lot of it. And when you look at the sort of near R1 billion that disappeared from Tembisa, and the appalling state that a lot of the hospitals are in, and the fact that probably 80% of the hospitals would not be considered suitable for, or not get certification for NHI because they are in a terrible situation. this is just, watching a sort of crazy march on into socialism and onwards into the perfect society. It's absolute nonsense. I have absolutely no idea that, no doubt that it will end up being in a black hole and nothing will improve. I mean, the reality with all those hospitals that wouldn't now receive certification is if you fix the hospitals and you change a lot of the management, you wouldn't need the NHI. The system could work. It has in the past and it can in the future. But it's the fact that you've got the politicians you have running it and the bureaucracies that you have installed that allow the system to largely be milked. So, yeah, I agree with Sara.
Marius, what do you make of this? I struggle to not see a bit of an electoral angle here, which is maybe the ANC is hoping that NHI will be a vote winner. And despite the many problems with the legislation, despite the fact that even the government is really struggling to come up with even a facade of how it's going to pay for this project, it's probably, I think, going to try and push it ahead, or at least look like they're about to go through with it before the next election, in the hope that it will win support. Do you think that's the case?
Yeah, it looks like it. But I mean, it's an absolutely terrible piece of legislation. I mean, as Sara said, if we can just get the government clinics and hospitals that we have now working, then we'll already be on our way to ensuring people have decent standard of healthcare. The last figure I saw from the government itself said that only 15% of government clinics and hospitals met the standards that the NHI would require hospitals and so on to meet. And that's of government clinics. And it's also not really a money question. South Africa, for on percentage of GDP and percentage of health expenditure as coming from government expenditure, we actually spend quite a lot on health, but we're not getting bang for our buck, same as education and so on. And it'll just be getting another kind of pot of money, I think, for cadres to get their hands on. Remember, taxes will have to go up by a ridiculous amount to fund this. And people's taxes are probably going to go up by about 20 or 30 odd % to fund this kind of thing. And the thing is now, obviously, medical aids in South Africa are quite expensive, but this is your after-tax money. People have decided that they want to put this money into medical aid. Nobody is forced to go into medical aid, but you'll be forced to pay into the NHI. This is after you've paid your ordinary taxes, which should be funding government clinics and healthcare and so on. You'll be forced to then pay over and above that. And there's going to be a huge pot of money. And as it stands, I don't know if it's been amended in the new bill. I don't think it will be, but the health minister would basically decide how the money gets spent. And it's ridiculous. And it's just, I think there's going to be lots of resistance to this, not just from Discovery, but I think lots of organizations in this country, including doctors themselves. I think we'll see an exodus of medical staff, and I think of just ordinary South Africans. This is going to be very damaging for healthcare in South Africa. And as I say, in a way, we already have universal healthcare, but just governments and clinics don't work as well as they should. And the way that they get working properly is make sure that money is not stolen, like happened at Tembisa Hospital. Make sure that people who aren't doing their jobs are fired or disciplined or whatever. But that doesn't happen. And that's why we see these terrible things where you read about somebody who hasn't been fed for 3 days by the nurses, or, a baby gets given the wrong medicine and dies, or, baby ends up with brain damage because they weren't delivered properly, or get cerebral palsy, or whatever the case is. So, this NHI bill is not going to fix anything. What you have to fix is, the staff at hospitals, and make sure that money is being spent properly and staff is doing the job that they are supposed to be doing.
Sara, any final thoughts before we move on?
I think it's obviously dealing with the corruption is huge. I mean, the charging extortionist amounts for material at Tembisa, like charging 230,000 for a mop in Eskom. It's that sort of thing. So you've got that complete lack of morality, and then you've got the incompetence. I mean, this whole issue of a baby dying, it was sort of sleeping in a box and it needed a incubator. I couldn't get, when I heard the reports on it, I couldn't quite get to how this issue had occurred and who was responsible and whether it was negligence or finance. I couldn't get to it. That is about fundamental hospital management, and if we don't get it, we can whistle Dixie as far as the NHI is concerned.
All right, let's move on to our last topic. And this is a opinion piece by Stevens Mokolapa, who I think is currently with Build 1SA, but he was formerly the DA mayor of Tshwane for about a year, from 2019 to 2020. The thing that kind of annoyed me about this opinion piece was he was talking, of course, about the Hammanskraal cholera outbreak, and he talked a little bit about the Rooiwal water treatment plant and the history of its corruption, that sort of thing. And he was a little bit scant on the details of what he did while mayor to address some of this issue. I believe the Human Rights Commission found the water there not so safe for human consumption during his tenure, during his time as mayor, and he doesn't really bring that up. But anyway, there was a very interesting part in this opinion piece, which I think should be discussed. He says, a functional state requires an activist electorate organized and ready to define and defend their interest and get rid of anyone seen as working against those interests. He goes on to say, political parties will come and go, as mayors have, but unless a system that gives power to unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats remains in place, we will continue to see humanitarian disasters such as we are seeing in Hammanskraal. Needless to say, bureaucrats succeed in their nefarious ways because of either of the support of their political principles or the negligence of their political principles in doing their jobs that they were elected for, to serve the best interests of their communities. This is why vigilant and activist communities must come to the party. They must hold councillors accountable for the behavior of the bureaucrats who work in municipalities that they've been elected to. And this comports, I think, with my experience of local government, is how there's obviously a problem with politicians in the country, but that's, I think, sort of well understood. The bigger problem in a lot of ways, I think, is with a civil service and bureaucracy, which is supposed to be professional and neutral, but has for 30 years been staffed with ANC appointees, cadres, minions who are supposed to carry out its ideological project or to benefit from patronage networks for the purposes of internal ANC politics. And until political parties are willing to properly confront that in a very serious way and use the proper disciplinary tools at their disposal, they're not going to make a lot of progress in changing the situation in the country. Marius, am I right?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And I know a councillor in Ekurhuleni, a DA councillor, had coffee with him a couple of times. He was just telling me how when the DA was in charge of Ekurhuleni, the stonewalling they would get from people involved in the administration of the municipality and so on would sometimes be, making people's jobs as difficult as possible. And as I was saying before the show, that they're not even necessarily people who are ANC supporters, just they have their own interests in making things difficult for the government, whatever the case is. And I think that's going to be a big issue if a coalition government ever does come to power, non-ANC coalition government, to turn things around in the country. There's going to be a lot of vested interests to prevent, whatever tenders being awarded or whatever the case is. And we were making a bit of a joke before the show, but I think it's true. I mean, that is actually South Africa's deep state, these kind of vested interest in the state and, sending resources a certain way and patronage and so on. And I think, and it's going to be something countries around the world have grappled with, where a reformist government comes in. But it's so difficult to turn things around because of these vested interests and just a complex thing like South Africa, like any complex entity, whether it's a big company or a big country like South Africa, to turn it around. It's not easy. It's not something you just, like when you're driving your car, you put your indicator on and then do a 3-point turn. That doesn't happen with a country like South Africa. It's a complex beast and it's going to be difficult to turn around. It's not impossible, but I think it's going to take some testicular fortitude to do it.
And I think this has been one of the problems with these coalition governments we've seen going forward. And I don't think this is true for all of them, but I'm thinking particularly of the ones in Gauteng, is that they've been so unstable and so focused on just trying to get some basic stuff done while coming into office that it's really, I think, opened up the scope for the bureaucracies in the big municipalities to kind of just do whatever they like, to run wild, to award themselves all of the contracts and to not do their jobs properly. And that needs to be changed, because unstable coalitions are not going away. So the parties are going to have to figure out how to grapple the bureaucracy whilst not being on the world's greatest footing. Sara, what do you make of this? Oh, I think Sara's
If we've
frozen
seen,
again.
if we've,
Ah, there you go.
sorry, if we've seen venality, in other parts of the public sector, then in municipalities, I imagine it's a feeding frenzy to a large extent. And you invariably have, and I think you have it in private sector as well, but on a massive scale in the public sector, you have people, single people or groups of people who have a very substantial network of corruption under their belt and, will not want to see it go away. And I think Helen Zille once has expressed that, the biggest problem is, if you try and take action against these people, you could end up dead. And that in South Africa is not an unrealistic possibility. So I think any opposition coalition or grouping will have to look at a very, very strategic way. You've got to get, I know it's very difficult. And one of the ways that it's always been dealt with is just to redeploy people, but that just spreads the problem elsewhere. They have to find a really serious strategy for firing people like this. You've got to get them out of the system so that the atmosphere and the sense of actually having a purpose changes. It's not an easy thing to do. I'm not for a second saying it is, but it has to be done. Otherwise, nothing changes.
Right. When the only options are failure or something difficult, you have to choose the difficult thing, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the place we're very much in. And it's probably going to require some good HR, labor lawyer people to really use the already, I mean, even if we change the country's labor laws, it's going to take a very concerted management effort to go through these municipalities and just slowly get rid of every single really bad egg. And a lot of other people will probably just toe the line, as you say, Sara, when the air is cleared and when the culture of the place changes. You don't need to fire everyone. You just need to get rid of the worst eggs, and most people will fall in line. All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friend Show. Also, please do check out on the Daily Friend YouTube page only. We did a YouTube rap show, which is a 10-minute version, basically, of this show. Leave a comment there and let us know what you think. We're just trying it out and seeing how it goes. Anyway, thank you very much, and we will see you tomorrow on the Daily Friend Show.